Now, let's get serious. So, the first comorbidity, ignorantitis. Now, ignorantitis arises, and it's an inflamed level of ignorance. In other words, it's deliberate ignorance, a wanton not wanting to know the truth. If we analyze our lives, we will easily discover that they are the unintended consequences of our desires, and mostly unwanted consequences of those desires. So we have to recognize that we engaged in the actions that created our suffering because of deliberate ignorance of what those consequences would be. In the same way that many people will eat a meal that they know will cause them indigestion afterwards, or some other problem, but they'll do it anyway because they want to enjoy the momentary flavor of the meal or whatever effect it has. Or they'll have alcohol knowing they'll get a hangover the next day. But these are intended consequences, but there are also the ones that are at least consciously unintended that create even more suffering. So the treatment has to be a paradigm shift out of ignorance. We have to, what we call that here is translation, to translate our understanding of our reality into a different mode in which we recognize that the body is a vehicle of consciousness. It's not who we are. And we treat that vehicle in a way that is truly rational, for its health and its well-being and its longevity, etc., but without identifying with its enjoyments and letting it get out of control. We keep it within moderation. This is basically what the Dharma is for, so that the body does not, and its sensory enjoyments do not take over our rationality. The appetitive does not overrule the cognitive, in other words. So that's enough for that one. Two is we suffer from normosis. And this is actually a psychiatrically recognized illness, normotic syndrome. It's a psychotic obsession with being normal. And so it's because of that normotic syndrome that people are willing to do what everybody else is doing. And if they're all getting injected with poison, let me do that too, you know, because it must be good for you if everyone is doing it. And so this desire to be normal, when the society's norm becomes sick and becomes self-destructive, if you stay normal, that is a problem. That is literally madness. So we have to transcend the norm. We have to be willing to be different and be alone, perhaps, and violate the norms in order to reach our highest potentiality, since the norm is going down and is a norm of unthinking herd mentality without any free will or free capacity for creative thought. So the treatment for that has to be a transformation of our identity from a being in the world who has to follow the way of the world when in Rome, or the Vaxican do as the Vaxicans do. No, you have to realize that we are with God and to become supernormal so that normosis can no longer infect us. Okay? So this is the cure for that comorbidity. The third one is more dangerous. It's galloping imaginosis. And this disease is really dangerous. It means that there's a constant flood of images in the mind. And most of those images are either erotically charged or aggressively charged or some other negative emotion. They're charged with depressive affect or anxiety or fear. And they keep coming up in the mind, and you can't stop them from within the ego. And if you are afflicted with these kinds of images, they will produce thoughts that produce urges, that produce drives, that will then cause acting out. So the images, when they build up, will produce effects. If they're erotically charged, they'll produce a wet dream, or they'll produce an acting out of a sexual nature. If they're angry images, they're going to produce an aggressive interaction. Every kind of image is going to produce psychological impetus toward an action that is in line with that image. So until we have eliminated this out-of-control imaginosis, we will not be able to have peace, because these images are constantly agitating us and causing us to be afflicted with either anxiety or depression or anger or something else that takes away our serenity, our peace, and our rationality. So imaginosis is needed to be treated with the transcendence of the ego mind. That's the only thing that will work, and that's why meditation is the cure for that comorbidity. But it has to be practiced long enough to extinguish the images, and one has to no longer want them to be produced. So the desire to have the mind filled with certain kinds of images, which underlies why they have appeared, has to be released. Okay, how many people suffer from any of these first three? Yeah, oh, okay, well, and I'm glad you're in the hospital getting treated now. So the fourth comorbidity is impacted sublimosis. So in medical terminology, if something is impacted, it's clogged, right? It's blocked. But we also mean in the psychological sense that you're impacted in a certain way. So the desire to transcend, to sublimate those images, those lower chakra urges, will get clogged. It will get stopped at a level of partial sublimation and won't be able to go beyond it. And one will get clogged at a certain point where one cannot release an obsession. And it could be a partially sublimated obsession. It could be with music or with art or with writing or with something else. But it's all still coming from an egoic place, and the partially sublimated creativity produces more imaginosis and produces more focus on the ego identity as somebody who has a certain talent or a certain ability that then they want to focus on, rather than focusing on the real self and the complete transcendence of ego consciousness. So you don't want to get caught. Great art comes from a totally sublimated consciousness that is then able to use the vehicle, both the body and the subtle vehicle of the soul, to produce creative works. But if they still come from the ego level, then they're not going to be very good, and they're not going to produce the result of true transcendence, and they won't be inspired. So you don't want to stop your sublimation at a level in which you're still within the ego, and you just want to be the best ego you can be, you know, in some way. That's not good enough, and that will end up causing a lot of bitterness at the end. So for that, the treatment is transfiguration. You have to recognize that you are not an ego in the world trying to be as good as you can be, but you are a manifestation of the God self that's beyond all intention, all desire, and every aspect of the creative intelligence moves from the supreme level, the supramental, not from within the mental range. And then it becomes truly powerful. Okay, how many people suffer from impacted sublimosis? Yeah, there's a few. Okay, well, you can get over it. Don't lose hope. But you do have to really work on it, because there's a desire to stay attached to that level that becomes a conscious obstacle. Okay, number 5. Dualitosis. Terrible, terrible disease. And it means that you value the unreal over the real. You prefer your life in duality to transcendence. You consider that transcending the ego would be a deprivation of all your fun. And you're still enjoying your suffering too much to want to get out of it entirely. So, and it could be in a very activist and philanthropic, or let's say a kind of remedial approach to wanting to improve life in the phenomenal plane. But when you focus on that level of trying to help the world, you lose touch with the supreme intelligence, which recognizes the perfection of everything and is the only level from which actual change can occur. Otherwise, everything is affected by karma, and you won't be able to change the trajectory of that karma. So dualitosis, which is the immediate reflexive impression of reality as being objective, and focusing on the world as an external objective field of beings that you are working with or on or trying to help. There will be rescue fantasies that come out of dualitosis, and fight or flight modes of relating. But dualitosis is really the root cause of many of these comorbidities. So the only way that you can treat this is through transvaluation. You have to value non-duality more than duality. And that means you have to sacrifice your belief in the subject as well as the object. And recognize that the real I is not the one in duality that wants to do something good in the world, or wants to get something from the world, or wants to accomplish something great before their body dies and all of that. It's the real I is the eternal, immortal, infinite I that is the only one that can actually accomplish anything of true value and true significance that is lasting. So the treatment of transvaluation is essential. Okay. Next one is very difficult. Solipsitis. I hope no one here suffers from that. What happens when you begin to meditate and to recognize the world as a dream is you begin to think that you are the only one who's conscious, and that the world is actually only made up of a single consciousness. There aren't really a multiplicity, and you start to treat other beings as if they are not conscious. There's a kind of a sense of indifference and of almost a nihilistic solipsism that thinks I'm the only one that's real, I'm the only one who gets it, I'm the only one who understands. And when identifies that I not as the supreme consciousness, but either as the ego or as a soul monad who is facing a dream field that has no reality. But the truth is, this is an intersubjective, intermonadic plane where everyone is equally a manifestation of that supreme reality. So solipsism is not an accurate evaluation of the nature of the phenomenal plane. But very often you get this, particularly if the EOS is of a narcissistic variety. It becomes easily self-involved and not interested in anything in the world and only wanting its own comfort. And it completely separates itself from the need that we have to serve in the phenomenal plane, because it's only through service that we transcend the ego and the narcissistic boundary that creates the solipsistic separation. So the solipsitis, it can be a very difficult one to get rid of, because you don't think there's any help because there isn't anybody else out there. So the only way to treat that is a transmutation, in which you recognize that the I, the self, is not a separate individual from the world, but is actually a manifestation of the entirety that is omnicentric, not simply unicentric, and that center of consciousness appears everywhere equally. So that's that one. The seventh one is not so bad. So I've called it mild. It's mild Coronanoosis. So what this means is that you've reached a point where you actually have intermittent contact with your crown chakra. You actually have some glimpses of ultimate reality. But then you come back into a mental congestion and you relapse into conjunctive myotosis for long periods. And you rest your laurels on past experiences. There are a lot of people who they go through an ayahuasca ceremony and they come back and say they've gone through ego death and they're liberated and all of that, but they're very much back in their ego and nothing really much got accomplished at all. You have this with lots of so-called entheogens, or states of altered consciousness that are very temporary, but they produce a halo effect for a long time, and then the ego lives off of them and presents itself as already liberated when it's still back in a very congested state, and very much identified with the body and needing more chemicals in order to try to return to a higher state. So we don't want that kind of a dependency. But it's relatively mild in the sense that at least one is touching into that higher consciousness and recognizes it as a reality, and that tends to create a magnetic pull, which creates the urge to reach that state as a true established reality of one's being, not just a momentary tourist trip to Chakra 7, but to learn to actually live there and abide as the self. So this can be treated, but it does require a complete egoectomy and an atmic enucleation, which means you have to remove your essential self from all of the imaginary forms of liberation that you may have glimpsed through drug experiences or other altered states, and reach that purity of consciousness that is transcendent of experience or of duality. And once that has been achieved, then you will have the corona for real and the full noetic capacity without falling back into a congested state. So that's the cure, and those are the comorbidities. I hope everyone understands that these can all be cured, and none of them are hopeless. They are contagious, however, and so you don't want to spread it around or get infected by others, especially if you have a tendency to normosis. So do stay out of that and remain in a complete state of individuation, and you'll be safe. Okay? So that's all I have on that one. If there's, I'll open the floor if there's any questions about this before we go on further. Okay, everyone knows how to cure themselves, and you understand the meaning of all of these morbidities. Do we have any questions about this, Purusha, online yet?
No questions yet, just many comments about it.
Oh yeah? Okay, well, let's go on a little bit further and then we'll deal with those. So the next, let's see, make sure I have enough time to do all of this. If you're going to treat yourself and really attempt to cure yourself of these comorbidities, then it's important to take certain diagnostic tests. They don't involve PCR swabs or anything like that, but they are 7 questions you really have to ask yourself in order to clarify where you are at, because there's a lot of self-deception that keeps these morbidities in place. And self-deception is probably underlying all of them, really. So the first question to ask yourself is, who or what ordains my destiny?